Okay, all right. So for today's Mythbusters session 1 at our Staff Assembly General Monthly Meeting, our featured guest speakers from HR are both compensation managers. We have Maria Lucia Gonzalez from the UC Davis campus and Brian Linhart from the UC Davis Health campus. So we grouped all of your submissions, your many submissions that we deeply appreciate, into categories. So today we will be covering questions submitted about salary and compensation, as well as equity increases with our compensation manager guests. If you have follow-up questions, you can either put them in the chat or send them to me directly. We do have a lot of questions to get through today, so no guarantees that we will address them. But if something comes up that is related that needs clarification, feel free to send it to me and we will try and cover that too. Okay, we will jump right in with Maria and Brian. First, we will be covering salary and compensation questions. Question 1 was our most asked question. It was asked 8 times in 8 different iterations by different folks. Is it an actual policy that lateral transfers, transferring to another department in the same title code, grade, or classification, cannot receive any salary increase? Maria, I see you. Hold on, let me search for Brian.
Brian's on. Brian, are you on?
I am, sorry. How are you?
Yes, great.
Brian's going to be taking the first 6 and I'll be taking from there on.
Okay.
Okay, I can do that. We can kind of chime in, I think, Maria.
Yeah, we can chime in 2 together, so not a problem.
Yeah, that sounds good. So as far as transfers, it depends on, like everything depends on what you're talking about, like what type of employee. If you're a non-represented employee or a union employee, a little bit. But for the most part, that's true. If you're an individual contributor employee, and I guess I'll say to Davis Health in particular, that you would normally have a pay increase on a lateral transfer, right? Because the job is valued the same, it's classified in the same salary range. Under a non-represented policy, there are exceptions for that locally, however. Some examples would be if you go into a same salary grade, right? So we always look at the maximum of the salary range if it's a promotion, demotion, or a lateral. And so if the top of the salary range, the maximum of that salary range for non-represented staff is the same, right? It's the same grade. Let's say it's a grade 22, if that makes sense for folks, then it's a lateral. It's considered lateral. Exceptions would be if you go in the same salary grade, but you become a supervisor or manager in that same salary grade. That's an exception in our policy. You can have a pay increase because you're going from an individual contributor to a supervisor or manager position. Another exception would be if you're going from non-exempt to exempt, because you have potential loss of pay, right, with ancillary pays or overtime. And so you would also have an exception under policy. And the third type is there's actually 4, I guess. The third type over on campus more commonly would be if you go from a contract position to a career position, because you're kind of changing the appointment type and the terms and conditions of employment, would be another exception. The fourth one is under management scope, if you're in a manager job and you have an increased scope of responsibility through an established practice, that would also be an exception. Over here, that would be if you go, for example, in the ambulatory division from a small clinic to a very large clinic, the title is the same. They're all ambulatory care administration manager 1s, as an example. There's established practice that's been around about 20 years that you'd have a higher pay in the very large clinic. We track the factors with that management group on those types of things. So those are the 4 that we have under policy for non-rep staff. In general, for represented staff, under the contracts and under the policy that's existing overall, as an individual contributor, you normally would not have an increase for a lateral transfer, again, because the job is intended to be valued the same by the organization. So hopefully that helps. And Maria, you might want to jump in with anything additional.
Nope, you've covered it good.
Hopefully that makes some sense.
That was a lot already, but yes, I think that made sense. We have a follow-up question in the chat. Is there anywhere that employees can find that policy written down?
Yeah, it's in PPSM 30. So the PPSM for non-represented staff under salary administration. So we have some of that information already there. And I think that 3 or 4 examples are cited in that. We're continuing to look at that locally, of course, but that's the current policy and practice over the last let's say 5 or 6 years at least.
Okay, great. Thank you. All right, if I can find my mouse, I will go to the next question. Okay, great. Question 2. When moving jobs internally at UC Davis to another position in a higher title and classification, you cannot receive more than a 5 or 10% increase in salary. Myth or truth?
Yeah, I think it's a myth. It depends on the situation. Like a lot of the stuff, it depends on what employment unit you're in, because there's labor contracts or policy. If you're a PSS or MSP or a senior management SMG group, but in general, we'd have the parameters typically 0 to 25%, although it could be more than that, right? But the default over here, at least at Health again, over time was 5 to 10% as a default, but it depends on the situation. If you're low in the range, how much you're moving, what the comparables are, what the market is at the time. So there are a number of factors that would weigh in on that. These are employment actions as well, right? So they come under talent acquisition, but compensation works as consultants with these types of actions, lateral transfers or promotional things. We deal with more like with upward reclassification, which is similar to that. But it just depends on how much you're moving and what the comparison is, what the market is part of that. The 5 or 10% historically, just if folks are interested, they may not be, is because the PSS ranges, our non-represented salary ranges, used to be a 10% midpoint differential. And so 5% was kind of the default for a 1 grade change. But again, there's several factors that would come into play for movement on up in terms of either promotions or upward reclassifications, where it certainly is more than that at times.
Okay. And we have a follow-up in the chat. If this policy was quoted to you, is there a way to rectify the myth that was quoted when someone was in that situation?
It just depends. I think that's a default, but it's not a limitation, right? It just depends on the movement. So if you go 1 grade, typically you would have, like, let's say a 10% up to 10% increase. But if you move multiple grades, then that's not going to be sufficient most of the time. So I don't know if it's strictly under, it's not strictly under a policy, but it is under a practice of salary administration.
It is a practice, it's not policy, and could be circumstances where a person could get a reclass and not an increase at all. For the most part, it is, like Brian says, per grade 5%, but it really depends on the individual situation. There is nothing in policy within the UC or internal to the campus that identifies specifically, but it is campus practice.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I guess for the union jobs as well, that's defined under those labor contracts, right? So under reclass, promotion, and transfer most often, and it usually states minimums that are required for those things. So we have to have minimums in those cases, and then for non-represented policy-based staff, it's kind of a practice-based thing. So with also usually minimums, but there's some discretion involved in that as well.
Okay, we'll move on to question 3. Even if they change positions multiple times within 1 year, the maximum pay increase an employee can receive in 1 year is 25% of their starting salary, even if the newest position's posted wages exceed that amount. Myth or truth?
Yeah, that's a myth as well. I think at 25% as a parameter, typically is a guideline similar to that 5 or 10%. But it depends. If the minimum of your new higher salary range is more than 25%, you can't be paid less than the minimum of the range. So we don't green circle people, it's called. Green circling is where you're paid below the minimum of the range established, and red circling is where you're paid above the top of the maximum of the range. So if the minimum of that new salary range for non-represented staff or for union staff is below that, then you have to be paid. That's minimum, like step 1 or bottom of the grade if you're non-rep. So it's not often that happens, that you take a job with that much of a change, or you're reclassified even less often and something like that. but it would be a requirement in that case. Beyond that, we do over 25% increases, although in compensation for the current positions, right, which is what we do, current positions that get revised. That's fairly rare that happens, but it does happen. It occurs more often on employment actions with our talent acquisition group because you're taking a wholly separate job. But again, they're more by exception than they're fairly uncommon.
So the 25% rule used to be in place in the UC before, and that a few years ago went away, but it does only apply to stipends. So stipends cannot be more than 25% above an employee's salary, and that is a system-wide Office of the President policy.
Okay, Alan has summarized the chat quite well. Many answers are emphasizing that it depends in certain situations. Who can an employee talk to better understand how it depends in their own case?
So, we are a decentralized environment, so there are HR business partners throughout the campus. I'm not sure what area you fall under, but we do have HR managers throughout the campus that are our colleagues that we work with that should be able to answer questions to staff and assist them. They are technically HR directors for all of the areas, division colleges. So really depends on what area you fall under, what division you're under.
Okay, and we have another question. Where can we find the policy about the stipend max that you were referencing, Maria?
It is in, what's the policy, system-wide policy number, Brian? PPSM 30, the system-wide level?
Yeah.
It's PPSM 30. You could go onto the Office of the Chancellor, type in PPSM 30, and it'll bring up the policy in there. There's a section on stipends.
Yeah, everything you see there's an overall system-wide policy, and then the locations individually kind of extrapolate on that policy, right? They may have some variance or additional detail that the overseeing policy doesn't have system-wide.
So we usually, the local policy, we can have a local policy off that policy, and usually it's refined more.
Yeah, the system-wide has minimums, for example, right? And so we can then kind of have additional detail above those minimum thresholds.
Okay, we'll move on to question 4. Any raise over 10% has to be reviewed by central HR. Myth or truth?
Yeah, this will vary depending on your location a little bit. So with Davis Health, we review either depending on the type of action it is. Central HR reviews all pay increases. So anything in terms of a stipend or a reclassification or an equity pay increase or promotion demotion, it's centralized in that regard, along with the hiring manager or the authority that we're working with for a reclass, for example. So there's no minimum threshold to that. So I think it varies a little bit more on campus. Maria, if you want to address that.
Yeah, on the campus, a couple of things. I do approve all salaries that are above midpoint of the salary range. So anything that's above midpoint of salary range comes to me for review, including recruitments and reclasses or equities. But the compensation team also does look at obviously all pay adjustments. And if there's something of concern, they will discuss it with me. And at that point, but we also, look at the pay from the yearly equity program. So there is a level of oversight. So technically, as Brian said, there really isn't much in compensation that usually doesn't come to us for review and approval. That we always have to make sure that we can support it in case there's any concerns.
Okay, we have a follow-up in the chat that says, so is the local policy UC Davis overall? It seems as though you were implying that individual units could then decide to extrapolate for their own unit on the campus. Is that true?
All right, I'm not sure I understand the question again. And maybe the person that's asking the question clarify a little bit.
Yeah, Elizabeth, if you could put additional in the chat for us, sorry. Okay, we will move on to question 5 in the meantime. This is a longer one. It is impossible to have your salary increase via the steps for the position once you have gotten the job. The only chance to raise your salary is with union agreement raises each year or moving into a new position and requesting a specific step salary amount. Myth or truth?
So it depends again. It sounds like it's more for, there aren't step-based except for in the police forces, non-represented jobs and I guess our skilled craft area. So for the most part, we're in open ranges as non-represented staff, whereas most of the unions are in steps, which for the most part, it varies, but they're mostly 2% intervals, right? Usually 2 to 2.5% intervals, and you usually have to be paid on a step. So in either case, though, however, if you have increased responsibilities in your job, the potential for a pay increase, either into the grade, if it's open range, non-represented, or is on a step, if you're a represented employee, it just depends on your situation. In the union represented jobs, however, these things are all guided by the labor contracts, which vary in the different units a little bit, right, in terms of what they say in regard to equity. But overall, we typically would look at that, looking at your performance, looking at your employment history, all those types of things, and try to pay as equitably as possible for both non-represented and represented jobs. There's limitations to that based on the labor contract or policy, though, in terms of the equity increase. So it's not just that if you have a job change, you could have an equity increase within your current job. It just depends on the situation. When we do it for union jobs, it's changing the terms and conditions of your employment. So the union is also involved in that in terms of union notice for the most part. Whereas non-represented jobs, it's open range, it's by policy and practice. We typically try to funnel things into our once a year non-represented staff equity program. Although certainly we do ad hoc reviews as well, where they can't wait that long and where they need to be addressed more immediately. We have those every month with both non-represented staff and unionized staff.
Okay, with the salary tracks, I have a follow-up question. When is one expected to hit the midpoint and third quartile of their salary? Why do these exist if staff routinely can never logically reach those numbers?
Yeah, it depends on your occupation a bit and your history and all that good stuff, ability to pay for the organization. Usually most of the time in terms of an open range staff, the midpoint, the area around the midpoint, and it's not really a point, right? It's usually, there's always a confidence interval, for example, in stats, where there's a room around that. It's supposed to be a market median based pay. And so that's usually a fully operational person who would be expected to be plus or minus a certain amount towards that. It's telling you that's what the value of your job is in the marketplace. Now, it's not completely always true, right? It's kind of the best estimate because it's a very large system. The grades for non-represented staff are maintained system-wide by Office of the President, working with all the locations. And so it's not always the case that an occupation midpoint is the actual market value at that point in time, especially right now with the market changing so much with various factors, right, in the last year or two. But for the most part, that's the intent of the salary range, to be at that. And what your market values in terms of being fully operational will in truth vary on your occupation. Some occupations it takes longer than others. So these are kind of general rules of thumb in terms of that. The goal would be, after a certain amount of time, you would expect to be paid around that midpoint. And as you become very senior, very competent in your work, and then you'd be higher in the range than that. But it varies a little bit, again, on those factors, history, ability to pay, all those types of things. But that would be the goal for the compensation program in terms of market median values.
Thanks. I have a few private DMs and we have a few public ones. The certain amount of time, Rob's example, I have 29 years of service, 17 years in the same position. I'm still not at midpoint. And then a couple in the DMs. I have 5 years and I consistently receive exceptional ratings. how do I leverage that into more money if superiors say nothing can be done to get me to midpoint?
I don't know the context, Rob. Are you in campus?
Yes.
Okay.
I mean, the campus has the annual equity program and there is the merit, but we have to keep in mind, there was a period of time that we didn't have a merit increase. It is a responsibility of management to obviously look, especially in the annual equity program, to see where people fall. And we give everybody every year, in reference to the equity program spreadsheets that identify where people fall in the range, and in the quartile. And then management is responsible to look at that and determine if they can afford or have the ability to be able to give some adjustments to try to move people within their range. And then we obviously review it and determine if it's something we can support also. The methodology is to try to, in the compensation world, is if we have the money to be able to do it, try to move people as close as possible to midpoint if they have the seasoned experience and or beyond that. And the methodology is the equity program annual and the off-cycle equity, if they need to put in for an off-cycle equity. That is the mechanism. The merit increase, of course, gives you an increase, but you're still staying within your range, right? So really, the annual equity program is an avenue.
Okay, we have a few more echoing. We will cover equity program specific questions after these salary and compensation ones. So I think we'll move on to these, finish this section, and then we can talk more about the equity program. Thank you, everybody, for your questions. Question 6 on salary and compensation. How is it that someone can make a higher salary doing the same job at a different UC but work remotely?
You may take this one first, Maria.
Yeah, go ahead and take this one.
Okay. Yeah, it's becoming more interesting, right? Because of the nature with COVID and more remote work being available and necessary than it was in the past. But the state of California is very much driven by geographic differentials, and the university and most organizations still are, right? Maybe at some point that's going to change, and it's kind of starting to change as it becomes more and more of an issue. Where if you can work remotely, which is the compensation function is largely worked remotely over the last year and a half, because we can do that in our jobs. Most people come out to do job audits. But right now we set it up by geographic differentials. For example, the cost of labor in San Francisco is like 15 to 25% higher than that of Sacramento. So the compensation administration has been set up accordingly, although it's something that's been more and more an issue that we're looking into. So if you're hired by San Francisco, yet you're still living in, say, in Sacramento or Davis, you're being paid off San Francisco wages because it's where the home department is, and the city is actually, pays a lot more because of the cost of labor. The cost of living is even much more significantly higher than that. So I think it just, that we're still set with our geographic differentials because that's been an established practice, and it's actually been pretty consistent in California for like the last 25 years. It varies by a few points here and there on the areas where the cost of labor goes up. But that's really what it's still based off of for the most part right now, although it's certainly an issue we're looking more and more into, not only locally, but more so system-wide, right, as it becomes more apparent that people are able to take jobs remotely and can take big pay increases potentially in the example of working in Sacramento and having a San Francisco job would be the most extreme, probably in Northern California. I don't know if that helps. I think it's kind of a work in progress with most organizations across the country probably right now.
Yeah, I mean, it is, Brian. I think that's something in conversation at the OP at the system-wide level where, we have people that, not necessarily here, but there are people that work remote and they could be in Nebraska, but they're being paid, maybe Southern California salaries to work remote and vice versa. So that's, I think, a conversation at the system-wide level at this point. So I think there's more to come on that. But for right now, it is our national index, which is our cost of labor in this area is 110%, which is comparable to Santa Cruz. I think, I don't remember Merced what they're at, but San Francisco is like at 123, 25%, and Berkeley is high because they're in a different geographical area. And that is the way the compensation works in the compensation world, not only here to the higher education, but all in industry also,
Yeah.
the cost of labor.
Okay, I have a follow-up on that one as well. When you talk about conversations are being had about this, does that mean that lower pay for 100% remote employees is on the horizon?
Honestly, it's just, I haven't heard that. I think what's in conversation at the system-wide level with the comp managers, everybody's having this issue where they're hiring and people that are remote, but do we pay them the California's salaries, or we pay them Nebraska, right? Because Nebraska, the cost of labor is lower. Or do we? So that's just what's in conversation starting. We've had some conversations, but I haven't heard anything else from OP. So that is something that's going to be led by Office of the President, and it needs to be by them.
Okay, thank you. We will move to question 7, another long one, sorry. Is it HR policy that higher paid non-represented staff may not receive an equity increase because the gap between the higher paid senior staff and the lower paid represented or non-represented staff is too large? So the gap between the highest paid and assuming the lowest paid employee in the unit is too large. If yes, where is that written, and how do we increase those represented or lower paid titles to decrease the salary gap?
Okay, so it's a myth. And what I mean by myth is, if I'm reading this right, there's folks are saying that that nothing can be done in order to rectify that, and that can be rectified. So what happens is, if management requests that we look at the salary of the individual, we'll look at it, and compensation will come back with a recommendation of a potential adjustment. It's up to management to determine what they can afford to go ahead and give. So if I'm reading this right, it's saying that represented people could be making more than the non-represented. Is that correct? that how
No,
I'm
I
reading
think it's
this?
asking, is it policy that the higher paid staff may not receive an equity increase if the gap between the senior staff and the lower paid staff is too big?
I've not seen anything in policy, no. So it's, a lot of things are individual. Also, we'll look at individual situation. It's really up to management and to determine if they would like to adjust someone's pay. So if we're asking if this is a myth because there's a policy, there is no policy to this.
Okay. Okay, I'm gonna scan the chat really quickly, sorry. Okay, we're gonna move on to question 8, which is our last question for salary and compensation. Retention bonuses, real or not?
Real. Recently, the Office of the President developed a retention bonus policy where their retention lump sum payments, where if a person is looking at, if maybe his position is a highly critical position to the campus, impacts the university, that if this person was to leave, it would cause detrimental harm to the unit. They can put in for a retention lump sum to retain that employee. It is a 1-year commitment for the employee. It cannot be more than 10% above their current salary. And that is a reality. Just recently, just put into place, I guess, Brian, you can also step in maybe a couple months ago. And we keep in mind that critical operational need to the university. So this is just not a job that is something that we can't justify to Office of the President. It has to go for approval. It comes to us, it goes to Christine, our Human Resources Officer, for approval. She must support it. And then at that point, it goes to Office of the President, and the system-wide Vice President of Human Resource, the entire UC system has to approve it. So this is not something we take very lightly. And we look at it, see if it's something we can obviously defend and support, but it is true.
Would you say that that assessment goes off of position title or who the staff member is and how much institutional knowledge they have?
It's again, not positional title or who the staff member, it's the job, the criticality of the position. So maybe this person is in the process of being, someone's interviewing them. We don't want to lose them. They're interviewing, they're being what we call poached in our industry. They're being sought out by other employers, and we cannot lose them on this campus. And that is the nature of responsibility and the position uniqueness of what detrimental harm it would cause the campus. It's very specific and very Office of the President specific, and it's very well thought out of what is required of it to support it.
Okay, we have a couple additional questions about that. Are these bonuses only for people who have campus-wide scope? And clarifying critical to what level, the department, the dean's office?
It really depends. There's nothing, it's not a black and white thing. I can tell you, it depends on the situation and what the justification is. I think the ones I've gotten have been, jobs that are the unit is severely understaffed. And if this person was to go, there would not be enough support to maybe continue services. Okay, so that kind of thing. So it's really hard to get in specifics, detail. I can't give you like black and white answers because it really depends on the circumstances of it. Not necessarily level and classification, or it doesn't matter. It's just that piece of the uniqueness of the job and how critical it is for this campus to keep that employed.
Yeah, and this is a new program. It's reactive to the traction retention issues across the UC system. It was directed again by Office of the President, like Maria was saying. And so it's specific to each location, but there's a very detailed process that Maria had mentioned that goes up to the Chief Human Resource Officer system-wide to look at individual requests. And usually there's two things that we're kind of looking at is why is there a retention issue right now? What's the issue? Why now? Why retention is kind of key. And then second would be kind of what's special about this person and their skills and the position that's required. So those two kind of basic questions have to be met, to provide the bonus. And it's just for non-represented staff, right? At presently, it's under non-represented policy that it was triggered. That we're currently doing it. So it's fairly limited, like to the 10% you all had talked about as far as the bonus in exchange for a year of additional work.
Okay, thank you. We are going to switch gears a little bit to the equity increase questions, which I know are going to be popular. Our first equity increase question: if a new staff member from outside the university starts at a higher wage than current staff, are equity increases effective back paid to when the new employee started at higher pay?
The answer to that is no. Equity increases are effective just like any like reclasses. The beginning of the new pay period from the date of receipt that we received the request in HR and compensation. So the equity request came in May 1st and we approved the equity increase. The equity increase will be effective on the employee that they're requesting it June 1st. Same thing with reclasses.
All right. Question 2. I do see your question, Alan. I will ask that after the end of the equity increase questions. Question 2, is there a policy in place to hold management accountable of ensuring that staff are paid equitably and ensuring that new staff aren't getting paid higher wages than current staff? Managers submitting for staff for an equity increase doesn't always happen.
Policy, no, there's no policy, but management does have responsibility to look at their employees' pay. As I mentioned before, the annual equity program is a way also that HR initiates for management to look at people's pay to determine who they'd like to go ahead and move forward with to try to move them. And we recommend to them folks that maybe should be moving within their range. And then there's the off-cycle equity program, but there's nothing in policy. But it is, in my opinion, the responsibility of management to look at their employees and determine what they can do to retain employees and move them through the range. It's going to be something management should do, and we obviously are open to conversation to assist them with that and guide them and provide them feedback.
So HR reaches out annually at the start of the equity program window.
Correct. So the equity program window, and Brian, you could step in. Equity program is every January of every year, but already by around November, we're already in December. We're definitely, moving in gear to get the spreadsheets out to the campus on their populations and where people are falling within their quartile, like if they're below where they're at. And then we have conversations with them annually. But there's also the off-cycle equity where if for some reason they feel there's something that can't be addressed at the annual equity program, then we can obviously look at it as an off-cycle to see what we could do to try to address the issue if we can't wait for that annual equity program.
Okay, so managers at least once a year should be very aware of where their staff are falling in comparison to one another and on quartiles.
Yeah, and I see a message here. The reports go to the HR business partners for all the areas. So that keep in mind, everybody has an HR director, HR manager that works collaborative with compensation as we are decentralized. That's where the spreadsheets go to, and then they meet with their managers respectfully. And then we get back the results of what they would like to do. And after they've recommended.
Yeah, that's part of the purpose of our annual program, to kind of take a pause and see where people are compared to one another. As part of that, there's always a few different criteria in that program. But sometimes it makes sense for a person that's new to be paid more. It just depends on their relevant experience, right? For the most part. And so usually the more relevant experience you have, the higher you pay. But that's not always true, just work history. But that's one of the variables we look at as far as salary setting, is your relevant experience to that particular job.
Okay, we have a lot of questions on the theme of why is so much left up to our department and direct supervisor about base pay, and what training do managers receive when they start their roles so they can navigate all of these complex policies?
Accountability with employees' pay rests with management in their area. Compensation is here to advise, recommend, provide options, but we are not here as necessarily gatekeepers. We are here to facilitate and assist and advise. So managers are responsible for the employees in their area to look at their pay. We obviously are the ones that have those conversations with them and guide them.
Yeah, and we commonly will, if we get a request, if we receive a request, for example, for an ad hoc request, we'll always do due diligence and say, okay, well, you're addressing this one employee, but I'm seeing this other employee in the same situation. What about him or her? So that's part of our responsibility, and compensation is part of that advising, to make sure that we have due diligence in those processes. Or also in the equity program, it's constant. We always have those issues in the equity program where we're looking at other people and why they would or would not be treated in a similar way. It's part of that due diligence process, which isn't 100% right, but I think we try to do the best we can with that and working with managers.
We do. And I can tell you that we do. And sometimes we'll advise campus, and it's really the discretion of them to be able to. Sometimes we will tell them, we really feel you need to do something with this population, and folks will. They do listen to us. So we need to keep that in mind also.
Okay, I think we have one more equity increase question, and then I will go back to the chat. Question 3, staff in their first year in a role are not eligible for an equity increase, even if other team members in their same classification are receiving one. Myth or truth?
Myth. Folks are eligible for, well, let me see, make sure that I go back. They're not eligible for a merit increase. Is that what they're thinking? If you're on probation, if you're a probationary employee, you're not eligible for a merit increase until you complete probation. Some people that are not probation obviously will be eligible as long as their performance evaluation on file that meets and above. But this is specifically to equity, right? So that if a person is, there's nothing in policy that says you're not eligible for an equity if you're only 3 months into a job or 4 months into a job for whatever reason. We will look at it though, and review it and comp, but there's nothing in policy that says that.
Okay, going back to
Did I
the
answer the
chat.
question right? Did I answer it? I mean, did I answer it all? Did I leave anything out, or is that the way I interpret it? I want to make sure.
That's how I interpreted it also.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
Going back to the chat, it looks like there are a lot of broken links or not. Yeah, broken links on the career tracks pages that they're reporting. We're saving the chat. I can follow up with HR about those separately. And then there was a question from Alan that I wanted to go back to. What recourse does an employee have when they are told myths by management?
Myth by management. Well, I mean, the employees could always contact their compensation manager. And so we're here to assist the employee, to talk to them, find out what the situation is, and then we could certainly talk to management, but people need to feel free to reach out to us or to their compensation analyst that supports their unit also.
So compensation folks are a resource for individual staff as well as managers,
Yeah,
not
of
just
course.
managers.
Oh, yes, of course. Yes.
Okay, great. All right, and we have one final question on the PowerPoint and 1 minute left on our agenda. Great timekeeping, everyone, but me, because I was not paying that close of attention. Salary increase question. Why are titles that are currently being accredited or bargained into a unit, such as the system admin 2 to 3 titles, prevented from receiving any salary increases through equity or merit programs? Is that a real policy or just a UC negotiating tactic?
No, it is real, and Brian could certainly step in. It is real when you're in the middle of an accretion or of a position. Office of the President does not recommend we adjust the pays because there could be substantial impact along the way. Because if, for example, system administrators have been going on to like 3 years worth of negotiating, and when that gets settled, we're going to have to go back and adjust all those pays manually, and so it just makes it complicated. And so that is correct. However, recently, I think, the system administrators have been going on for a long time, and Office of the President said that we could certainly reach them out in an individual case and they would be willing to look at it. They can't guarantee that they will approve us doing anything, but normally, yes, in the middle of an accretion, we're with status quo. And status quo means we don't do anything in reference to that salary with those employees until the contract or that part is settled, right? So Brian, you could step in too, and make sure I wasn't missing anything.
That's right. I think that's good, Maria. It's really more of an employee labor relations question, probably, because the terms and conditions of their employment are tied into that bargaining process, and we don't have the right to do that, actually. So it's tied into the process of collective bargaining system-wide in the case of the system administrators. And so it's dealing with employee labor relations here locally and system-wide, and also with the unions as part of that. So it has to be negotiated under the terms and conditions of their employment.
Yeah, and Brian, if you want, I can just weigh in really quick. This is Steve Green from Employee and Labor Relations. The issue, as both Brian and Maria has said, it's actually a legal issue. It is illegal for the university to change mandatory terms and conditions of employment for a represented title code without bargaining it with the unit. And money, all economic terms and conditions of employment, wages, benefits, all those things are considered mandatory terms and conditions of employment. So legally, we cannot unilaterally provide any salary increases. We would need to bargain all of those. And so when we're bargaining something system-wide, that's part of the process, is to figure out what those accreted title codes, those new title codes that are added to the unit, what they're going to be paid now that they're represented. And that's the process that we go through. And as Maria mentioned, that we're in the status quo period, which means the university is obligated by law to maintain the same terms and conditions of employment to those employees that have just joined the bargaining unit. And that includes the wages and benefits until such time as we bargain those with the union. I hope that makes sense.
Yes, thank you.
Jennifer, I noticed there's a question on there from someone in reference to how do they find out who their compensation analyst is that supports their unit.
Mhm.
I would recommend you check with your manager or your HR director to that area. It depends on the unit. There's a lot of people on here. I couldn't necessarily tell you all 159 of you, but feel free to reach out to your manager. Your manager will know who your analyst is that supports the area. And if you ever have questions, please email me. I'm here to be able to help you. So I can certainly assist with your question and refer you to the right source if I can't answer it for you.
Thank you, Maria, because I can name that I know at least a few folks would not feel comfortable asking their manager for that contact information. Okay, that puts us at time. Thank you everyone for all of your follow-up questions in the chat. We are saving the chat. I will modify our running list of questions for HR, and we will figure out what questions we're going to feature in July based on questions from the chat and previously submitted questions from today. We did record the meeting and we will record in July as well. In addition to that, HR will be featuring the questions from today and July on a FAQ page. So this will live in written format on the HR website as well. Once we have some time to process through the transcript and the recording and all of that. So if you have any follow-up questions, please feel free to send them to staffvoice@ucdavis.edu, which is our staff assembly email address. And we will wade through all of this before our July additional meeting. Let me go ahead and stop. Oh no, I don't want to stop sharing. Sorry. With that, I do want to transition to our other announcement for today, which is our executive committee transition. So our staff assembly executive committee will serve through June 30th of this year, and our elections have closed, so we have announcements for next year's executive committee as well. First, I would like to put up the names of this year's executive committee and thank them from the bottom of my heart. We did a lot of work in the background this year, and it was would not have been possible without our entire executive committee. So I want to thank you all so much for your dedication. I know it was difficult through a year of remote meetings, but some people working in person and not really feeling a whole ton of connection the whole year. So thank you so much to this year's executive committee. And I will hand it over to Lauren, who maybe used my link to join the meeting to announce next year.
I used the link on our agenda, which I guess is your link. So I will work on changing my name. But hi, everyone, Lauren McDermott. I will be chair next year for staff assembly. And we have a wonderful group of people volunteering next year for our executive committee. So Jennifer, if you want to move, do we have a slide? Perfect. All right, so announcing next year's executive committee. So chair-elect next year will be Kyle Urban. Secretary will be Grace Woods. Communications chair will be Stephen Wilson Maggard. Outreach and marketing will be Bobby Boozer. Member engagement chair, we have Zoe Ballista Reynolds. We're going to have finance co-chairs next year, which will be Roger Moy and Lisa Feldman. Events chair, we have R. Paul Villaluz, and past chair, we're excited to have Jennifer sit with us again as our past chair, Jennifer Jackson, and coordinator, as always, will be Scott Lowentowner, and Scott has been a fantastic addition this year. So congratulations to everyone coming in onto the executive committee. We're looking forward to a really great year.
Awesome. Thank you so much, everybody. Now I will stop my share and stop